The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of San Miguel, a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. In a tiny house with peeling paint and a roof that leaked when it rained, 8-year-old Maria Santos sat by her bedroom window watching the world go by. Her thin fingers traced patterns on the glass as she watched other children run and play in the street below. 3 years had passed since the accident that changed everything, but Maria still remembered what it felt like to run so fast that the wind would whip through her long black hair. Maria had always been the fastest runner in her class at school. Her teacher used to say she moved like lightning, and during recess, no one could catch her when they played tag. She would race home from school every day, bursting through the front door with stories about her adventures and homework clutched in her small hands. Her mother Elena would smile and ruffle her hair, proud of her energetic daughter who seemed to have endless amounts of joy and curiosity about the world around her. But everything changed on that terrible day 3 years ago. Maria had been crossing the street to buy candy from the corner store when a delivery truck ran a red light. The driver had been looking at his phone instead of the road, and by the time he saw the little girl, it was too late. The impact threw Maria several feet, and when she woke up in the hospital 2 weeks later, the doctors delivered news that shattered her world. The accident had damaged her spine, and she would never walk again. Elena had sold everything they owned to pay for Maria's medical bills. The small savings account she had been building for Maria's education disappeared first, followed by her jewelry, their television, and even Elena's wedding ring. The hospital bills seemed to multiply like weeds, growing larger each month despite Elena working double shifts at the local diner where she served coffee and sandwiches to truck drivers and factory workers. The wheelchair the hospital provided was ancient and falling apart. It had been donated by a charity years ago, and Maria was probably the 5th or 6th child to use it. The left wheel constantly got stuck, making a grinding noise that echoed through their small house. The armrests were made of hard plastic that dug into Maria's arms, leaving red marks by the end of each day. The seat cushion had lost all its padding years ago, and sitting in it for more than an hour made Maria's back ache terribly. Elena watched her daughter's spirit fade a little more each day. Maria used to chatter constantly, filling their home with laughter and questions about everything she saw. Now she spent most of her time staring out the window, speaking only when spoken to. She had stopped asking about school, stopped talking about her friends, and worst of all, she had stopped smiling. Elena would catch her daughter crying quietly sometimes, and it broke her heart because she knew Maria was trying to be brave for her sake. The other children in the neighborhood didn't know how to act around Maria anymore. Some of them stared when Elena pushed the squeaky wheelchair down the street, while others looked away uncomfortably. A few of Maria's former classmates had tried to visit in the first few months after the accident, but conversations felt forced and awkward. The children would talk about running and playing games that Maria could no longer join, and eventually, the visits stopped altogether. Elena did her best to stay positive around Maria, but the weight of their situation was crushing her. She worked from 6 in the morning until 10 at night, serving endless cups of coffee and plates of food to customers who barely looked at her. Her feet ached constantly, and she had developed a permanent headache from the stress of trying to make ends meet. The rent was 3 months behind, and their landlord had already given them 2 warnings about eviction. At night, after Maria fell asleep, Elena would sit at their small kitchen table and try to figure out how to pay the bills. She would move numbers around on scraps of paper, trying to make their tiny income stretch to cover rent, food, electricity, and Maria's medical needs. No matter how she calculated it, there was never enough money. She had applied for government assistance, but the paperwork was complicated and the waiting lists were long. Elena had never felt so helpless in her entire life. Maria's old friends at school had moved on with their lives. They were playing soccer, learning to ride bicycles, and planning sleepovers that Maria could never attend. Through her window, Maria could see them gathering in the plaza after school, their backpacks thrown carelessly on the ground as they chased each other around the fountain. She remembered how it felt to be part of that group, to belong somewhere, and have people who wanted to spend time with her. The broken wheelchair made everything worse. Simple tasks like getting from her bedroom to the kitchen became major challenges. The stuck wheel would catch on the doorframe, and Maria would have to rock back and forth to free it. Going outside was nearly impossible because the wheels couldn't handle the uneven sidewalks and dirt roads. Elena would have to lift the front of the wheelchair to help it over every crack and bump, which exhausted her already tired body. Medical appointments were a nightmare. The wheelchair was too wide for some doorways, and the wheels would lock up unexpectedly, causing Maria to lurch forward dangerously. Elena lived in constant fear that her daughter would fall out of the unstable chair and get hurt even worse. She had asked the hospital about getting a new wheelchair, but they told her the waiting list was over a year long, and they would need to prove they couldn't afford to buy one themselves. Maria had dreams where she could still run. She would wake up thinking she could jump out of bed and race to the kitchen for breakfast, only to remember that her legs no longer worked. Those mornings were the hardest, when reality crashed over her like a cold wave. She had stopped telling her mother about the dreams because she could see how much they hurt Alina too. The small town of San Miguel wasn't equipped for someone with mobility needs. There were no ramps, no accessible bathrooms, and no understanding of what life was like for a child who couldn't walk. Maria felt invisible, forgotten by a world that seemed designed for people who could climb stairs and walk through narrow doorways. She began to believe that maybe she really was invisible, that maybe her life didn't matter anymore. Alina would sometimes catch herself crying while washing dishes or folding laundry. She felt like she was failing her daughter, unable to provide the medical care, the equipment, and the opportunities that Maria deserved. The guilt was overwhelming, especially when she saw other families with healthy children taking their blessings for granted. Alina prayed every night for a miracle, for something or someone to help them find a way forward. But each day brought more of the same struggles and disappointments. On the other side of town, past the main plaza and down a dusty road lined with old adobe houses, Carlos Mendez wiped the sweat from his forehead as he crawled out from under a rusty pickup truck. His small auto repair shop sat at the very edge of San Miguel, where the paved roads turned to dirt and the houses became fewer and farther between. The building itself was nothing special, just for concrete walls with a tin roof that rattled loudly whenever the wind picked up. A faded sign hanging above the entrance read Carlos Auto Repair in hand-painted letters that had seen better days. Carlos had been fixing cars for over 30 years, ever since he was 22 years old and full of dreams about building the best repair shop in the region. Back then, he had imagined expanding his business, hiring employees, and maybe even opening a second location in the city. But life had other plans, and now at 52, Carlos worked alone in his small shop, struggling to compete with the modern service centers that had opened in the larger towns nearby. The shop was cluttered with parts and tools that Carlos had collected over the decades. Old engines sat in corners covered with dust and spiderwebs, waiting for the day when Carlos might need them for a repair job. Shelves lined the walls, filled with bolts, filters, and spare parts organized in coffee cans and cardboard boxes. Everything had its place, even if that place might look like chaos to an outsider. Carlos knew where every wrench and socket was located, and he could find the exact part he needed even in the dim light of early morning or late evening. Business had been slow for months now. People were taking their cars to the newer shops in the city, places with computerized diagnostic equipment and air-conditioned waiting rooms. These modern shops could run tests that Carlos could only dream of, and they offered warranties and payment plans that a one-man operation like his simply couldn't match. Carlos relied on experience and intuition to diagnose problems, skills that had served him well for 3 decades but seemed less valuable in a world increasingly dependent on technology. Carlos lived in a small apartment above his shop, which meant he was never really away from work. He would often hear cars driving by at night and wonder if any of them might stop for repairs in the morning. His living space was simple and sparse, containing only the basics he needed to get by: a single bed, a small table where he ate his meals, a hot plate for cooking, and a tiny bathroom that barely had room for one person. The walls were decorated with a few old photographs and a calendar from an auto parts supplier that was 3 years out of date. Money was tight, tighter than it had ever been in all his years of running the shop. Carlos often had to choose between buying groceries and purchasing the parts he needed for repair jobs. Some weeks he would fix a customer's car and then have to wait days or even weeks for them to pay him, which made it impossible to plan ahead or save for emergencies. His own pickup truck, the one he used to travel to auto parts stores and tow broken-down vehicles, was held together with determination and prayer. The engine made concerning noises, the brakes needed work, and the transmission slipped when he tried to accelerate up hills. Despite his financial struggles, Carlos had never lost his reputation for honesty and skill. Customers knew they could trust him to tell them the truth about their vehicles, even if it meant less money for him. While other mechanics might suggest expensive repairs that weren't really necessary, Carlos would often find creative ways to fix problems using used parts or simple solutions that saved his customers money. This honesty had earned him loyalty from many families in the area, but it also meant his profit margins were razor thin. Carlos had experienced profound loss in his life that shaped the man he became. 7 years earlier, his daughter Isabella had fallen ill with a disease that required expensive treatment. Carlos had mortgaged his shop, sold his savings, and worked day and night to pay for her medical care. For months, he had hoped that she would recover, that all the money and effort would be worth it when Isabella came home healthy and smiling. But the treatments failed, and Isabella died at the age of 12, leaving Carlos with crushing debt and a broken heart that never fully healed. After Isabella's death, Carlos threw himself into his work with desperate intensity. He would stay in the shop until midnight, taking on any job no matter how small or difficult. The work helped distract him from his grief, but it also isolated him from the community around him. He stopped attending social events, stopped visiting friends, and rarely spoke about anything other than cars and engines. His neighbors worried about him, but Carlos insisted he was fine and didn't need anyone's help or sympathy. The debt from Isabella's medical treatment still haunted Carlos every month when bills arrived. He had managed to avoid losing his shop, but just barely. The mortgage payments were behind, and the bank had already sent several warning letters about foreclosure. Carlos tried not to think about what would happen if he lost the shop, because fixing cars was the only skill he knew, and at 52, starting over seemed impossible. Carlos also supported his elderly mother, who lived in a small house across town. Rosa Mendez was 78 years old and suffered from diabetes that required expensive medication. Every month, Carlos would take a significant portion of his earnings to pay for her prescriptions and doctor visits. He never complained about this responsibility because Rosa had sacrificed everything to raise him as a single mother after his father abandoned them when Carlos was just 5 years old. The neighborhood children often gathered around Carlos's shop in the afternoons. Fascinated by the mysterious world of engines and machinery, Carlos would sometimes let them hand him tools or explain what he was doing, enjoying their curiosity and enthusiasm. These moments reminded him of Isabella, who used to spend hours in the shop asking endless questions about how things worked. The children had no idea how much their presence meant to Carlos, how their laughter and chatter helped fill the silence that had consumed his life since his daughter's death. Carlos had a gift for seeing potential in broken things. While others might look at a damaged engine and see only scrap metal, Carlos could envision how it might be repaired and restored to working condition. This ability extended beyond cars and trucks to anything mechanical. Neighbors would bring him broken appliances, farm equipment, and even toys, knowing that Carlos could probably figure out how to fix them. He rarely charged much for these small repairs, considering them favors for friends rather than business. Transactions. The tools in Carlos's shop were mostly old but well maintained. He had inherited some of them from the mechanic who taught him the trade, and others he had purchased used from estate sales and shop closures. Each tool had a story and a purpose, and Carlos treated them with the respect of a craftsman who understood that good tools were essential for good work. He would spend his evenings cleaning and organizing his equipment, finding peace in the familiar routines of maintenance and preparation. Carlos slept poorly most nights, his mind racing with worries about money, work, and the future. He would lie in bed listening to the sounds of the night, the distant hum of traffic on the highway, the settling of the old building around him. Sometimes he would think about Isabella and wonder what she might have become if she had lived. Other times he would plan the next day's work, trying to figure out how to stretch his meager resources to cover all the expenses that seemed to multiply like weeds in his small business. The blazing afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked pavement as Elena pushed Maria's wheelchair along the uneven sidewalk toward Carlos's auto repair shop. The left wheel had finally given up completely that morning, locking in place and refusing to turn no matter how hard Elena tried to force it. Maria sat quietly in the broken chair, her small hands gripping the armrests as the wheelchair lurched and bumped over every crack and stone in their path. Elena had heard about Carlos from other people in the neighborhood. They said he was honest and skilled, someone who could fix almost anything with wheels or an engine. More importantly, they said he was kind to people who didn't have much money, sometimes accepting payment in installments or even trading work for food or other necessities. Elena hoped desperately that he might be able to help them, because she had already called 3 other repair shops and none of them would even look at a wheelchair. The journey to Carlos's shop took almost an hour because Elena had to stop frequently to rest her aching arms and back. Pushing the broken wheelchair was like trying to move a shopping cart with square wheels, requiring enormous effort for every few feet of progress. Maria apologized over and over for being such a burden, which broke Elena's heart because her daughter had nothing to apologize for. Other pedestrians stared as they passed, some with curiosity and others with pity, but no one offered to help. When they finally reached the repair shop, Elena was exhausted and sweating heavily despite the lightweight dress she wore. The building looked humble and weathered, with oil stains on the concrete floor and the smell of motor oil and metal hanging heavy in the air. Through the open garage door, they could see a man in grease-stained coveralls working under the hood of an old sedan, his movements careful and precise as he adjusted something deep in the engine compartment. Carlos looked up when he heard the squeaking and grinding of the wheelchair approaching his shop. He wiped his hands on a rag and walked over to greet them, his weathered face showing concern as he took in the sight of Elena's exhausted expression and Maria's obviously broken wheelchair. Elena explained their situation in a rush of words, her voice cracking with emotion as she described how the wheelchair had been getting worse for months and had finally stopped working completely that morning. Carlos knelt down beside the wheelchair to examine the problem, his experienced hands running over the wheels and axles with the same careful attention he gave to car engines. The left wheel was completely seized, its bearings worn out and its axle bent from years of hard use and poor maintenance. The right wheel wasn't much better, wobbling dangerously and threatening to fall off entirely. The frame of the wheelchair was cracked in several places, held together with electrical tape and determination rather than proper repairs. As Carlos studied the wheelchair, he asked Maria gentle questions about how long she had been using it and what problems she had noticed. Maria answered quietly, her voice barely above a whisper as she explained how difficult it had become to move around their house and how impossible it was to go anywhere outside. Carlos listened intently, nodding and making small sounds of understanding. As he continued his examination of the broken equipment, Alina watched Carlos work, hoping against hope that he might have some solution for them. She had brought the small amount of money she had managed to save from tips at the diner, but she knew it wouldn't be enough to pay for major repairs. When Carlos finally stood up and brushed the dust from his knees, Alina held her breath waiting for his verdict. She could see the sympathy in his dark eyes, and somehow that made her feel even more afraid of what he might say. Carlos shook his head slowly as he looked at the wheelchair, and Elena's heart sank. He explained gently that the chair was beyond repair, that the frame was too damaged and the mechanical parts too worn out to fix safely. Even if he could patch it together temporarily, it would only break down again within days or weeks, possibly causing Maria to fall and get hurt. The wheelchair had simply reached the end of its useful life after serving too many children for too many years. Alina felt tears welling up in her eyes as Carlos delivered this news. She had expected it might be expensive to fix, but she hadn't prepared herself for the possibility that it couldn't be fixed at all. The cost of a new wheelchair was completely beyond their means. Thousands of pesos that might as well have been millions given their financial situation. Alina began to apologize for wasting Carlos's time, gathering herself to push Maria home in the same broken wheelchair they had arrived in. But something in Maria's expression stopped Carlos from letting them leave. The little girl sat perfectly still in her broken chair, her dark eyes reflecting a sadness that seemed far too deep for someone so young. Her thin shoulders were slumped in defeat, and she had the look of someone who had stopped expecting good things to happen in her life. Carlos saw something in Maria that reminded him powerfully of his own daughter Isabella, the same quiet dignity in the face of circumstances beyond her control. Carlos asked Alina and Maria to wait while he disappeared into the back of his shop. He returned a few minutes later with 2 folding chairs and a thermos of cold water, inviting them to sit in the shade while he thought about their situation. Alina protested that they didn't want to take up more of his time, but Carlos insisted, saying that he wasn't busy and could use the company. He poured water into small paper cups and offered them to his guests, his manner gentle and welcoming despite their humble circumstances. As they sat together in the shade of the garage, Carlos began asking Maria about her life before the accident. Slowly, Maria began to open up, telling him about how she used to love running and playing with her friends at school. Her voice grew stronger as she talked about her dreams of becoming a teacher someday, and Carlos could see glimpses of the spirited child she had been before tragedy changed everything. Alina watched this conversation with amazement, realizing that Maria hadn't talked this much or shown this much animation in months. Carlos found himself thinking about Isabella as he listened to Maria talk. His daughter had been about the same, the age when she got sick, full of dreams and plans for the future that would never come to pass. But where Isabella's illness had taken her away completely, Maria still had her whole life ahead of her if she could just get the tools she needed to live it fully. The thought began forming in Carlos's mind that maybe he could do something to help, something that might honor Isabella's memory while giving Maria a chance at happiness. That evening, after Alina and Maria had gone home, Carlos sat alone in his shop staring at the broken wheelchair. He had told Alina he would think about what might be possible, but he hadn't made any promises because he knew his own financial limitations. Still, he couldn't shake the image of Maria's face, the way her eyes had lit up when she talked about her dreams, and the way that light had dimmed when she remembered her current reality. Carlos began sketching rough drawings on the back of old invoices, his mind racing with possibilities. He had never built a wheelchair before, but he understood wheels and axles and frames. He knew about weight distribution and mechanical advantage and all the principles that made vehicles move efficiently. Maybe, just maybe, he could create something that would give Maria back her mobility and her hope for the future. Carlos couldn't sleep that night. He lay in his narrow bed above the shop, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Maria's broken wheelchair and the sadness in her young eyes. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his daughter Isabella at the same age, full of life and dreams before illness took her away. The memory of Maria's quiet voice talking about wanting to be a teacher someday echoed in his mind, mixing with memories of Isabella's own dreams that would never come true. At 3 in the morning, Carlos gave up trying to sleep and climbed down to his workshop. He turned on the overhead lights and spread out several large pieces of cardboard on his workbench, then began sketching designs with a stubby pencil he kept behind his ear. His hands moved quickly across the cardboard, drawing wheels and frames and mechanical systems from different angles. He had built countless things over the years, from engine mounts to custom exhaust systems, but a wheelchair presented unique challenges he had never considered before. The first design Carlos sketched looked too much like the broken wheelchair Alina had brought to him. He crumpled up that piece of cardboard and started again, this time thinking about what Maria really needed rather than just copying what already existed. She needed something lightweight that wouldn't tire Alina when she had to push it. She needed wheels that could handle the rough streets and uneven sidewalks of their neighborhood. Most importantly, she needed something that would give her independence and dignity rather than making her feel like a burden. As the sun began to rise, Carlos walked around his shop looking at all the discarded parts and materials he had collected over the years. In one corner sat the aluminum bumper from a small truck that had been totaled in an accident. The metal was strong but lightweight, exactly what he would need for a wheelchair frame. Near the back wall, he found a pair of motorcycle wheels that a customer had never returned to pick up. They were the perfect size and had smooth bearings that would roll easily over almost any surface. Carlos spent the entire morning making detailed drawings and measurements. He calculated angles and stress points, figuring out how to make the wheelchair both comfortable and durable. He sketched padding designs and considered where to place handholds and footrests. By noon, he had filled 6 large pieces of cardboard, with drawings, notes, and calculations. The design that was taking shape looked nothing like a traditional wheelchair, but Carlos believed it would work better than anything Maria had ever used. The first challenge was money. Carlos had less than 200 pesos in his wallet, barely enough to buy groceries for a week. The materials he needed would cost at least 10 times that amount. Money he simply didn't have, but Carlos had learned over the years that creative solutions could often replace expensive purchases. He began making a list of everything he could use from his existing inventory and everything he might be able to get donated or traded for. Carlos started with the aluminum bumper, carefully cutting it into sections with his welding torch. The metal was harder to work with than steel, but it was much lighter and wouldn't rust in the rain. He spent hours measuring and remeasuring each piece, knowing that mistakes would waste precious material he couldn't afford to replace. The work was slow and meticulous, requiring all of his skill and patience to get the proportions exactly right. The motorcycle wheels needed modification to work properly on a wheelchair. Carlos removed the original bearings and replaced them with smoother automotive bearings that would require less effort to turn. He also widened the axles and added quick-release mechanisms so the wheels could be removed easily for storage or transportation. Each small improvement required hours of careful work, but Carlos found himself enjoying the challenge of solving mechanical problems in new ways. Word of Carlos's project began to spread through the neighborhood. Maria Santos, the baker who ran the small shop next to the plaza, heard about what Carlos was doing and stopped by his workshop with fresh bread and encouragement. She had known Maria since she was a baby and had watched the little girl's transformation, from a happy, active child to a withdrawn, sad shadow of her former self. Maria Santos offered to provide free meals for Carlos while he worked on the wheelchair, saying it was the least she could do to help. The local pharmacist, Dr. Rodriguez, had also heard about the project and came to Carlos's shop with a bag full of materials. He brought foam padding, vinyl covering, and even small wheels that could be used for the front casters. Dr. Rodriguez had treated Maria after her accident and had watched Elena struggle to care for her daughter with inadequate equipment. He was amazed by Carlos's designs and offered to help in any way he could. Even the children in the neighborhood became involved in the project. They started collecting bottle caps, aluminum cans, and other small items that Carlos could use for various parts of the wheelchair. The children didn't fully understand what Carlos was building, but they sensed that it was something important and special. They would gather outside his shop in the afternoons, watching him work and asking endless questions about welding and mechanics. Carlos worked late into the night every evening, his welding torch casting dancing shadows on the walls of his shop. The frame of the wheelchair began to take shape, looking elegant and modern compared to the clunky hospital chair that Maria had been using. Carlos paid attention to every detail, smoothing rough edges and making sure every joint was perfectly secure. This wheelchair would need to last for years, and Carlos wanted it to be beautiful as well as functional. The most challenging part of the design was creating a propulsion system that would allow Maria to move independently. Traditional wheelchairs required users to push the large wheels with their hands, but Carlos wanted something easier and more efficient. He designed a system using bicycle chains and gears that would allow Maria to operate the wheelchair with small hand cranks, similar to pedaling a bicycle with her arms instead of her legs. Carlos realized that his ambitious design would require an electric motor to help Maria navigate hills and rough terrain. He found an old car starter motor in his parts collection, but it was too powerful and would drain batteries too quickly. After days of experimentation, he discovered that a small electric motor from a broken washing machine could be modified to provide just the right amount of assistance. The motor could be powered by a car battery that would charge automatically as Maria operated the hand cranks. As the wheelchair neared completion, Carlos began to worry about whether his creation would actually work as intended. He had never built anything like this before, and he had no way to test it properly without risking damage to the delicate mechanisms. The entire project represented weeks of work and his last bit of savings, and if it failed, he would have nothing to show for his efforts except disappointed hopes. Carlos also worried about Maria's reaction to the wheelchair. What if she didn't like it or felt uncomfortable using it? What if the neighbors thought it looked strange or impractical? Carlos had poured his heart into every weld and every adjustment, but he knew that all of his work would be meaningless if it didn't truly help Maria reclaim her independence and joy. The weight of these concerns kept him awake at night, but also drove him to work even harder to make the wheelchair perfect. After 6 weeks of tireless work, Carlos stood back to admire his creation in the early morning light filtering through his shop windows. The wheelchair gleamed like a piece of art, its aluminum frame polished to a mirror finish and every component perfectly aligned. The custom seat was upholstered in bright blue vinyl that Dr. Rodriguez had donated, with thick foam padding that would keep Maria comfortable even during long periods of use. The wheels rolled silently on precision bearings, and the electric motor was hidden so cleverly within the frame that it looked like magic when the wheelchair moved on its own. Carlos had spent the previous night making final adjustments and testing every system multiple times. The hand crank mechanism worked smoothly, allowing the user to propel the wheelchair forward with gentle arm movements, rather than the exhausting push and pull motion required by traditional wheelchairs. The electric motor provided just enough assistance to make climbing hills effortless, and the battery could be recharged simply by plugging it into any wall outlet. Most impressively, Carlos had designed the wheelchair to fold completely flat, for easy storage and transportation. The entire town seemed to buzz with excitement about Carlos's project. Word had spread far beyond their small neighborhood, and people were coming from other districts just to see the custom wheelchair that the humble mechanic had built from scrap materials. Local newspaper reporters had heard the story and wanted to interview Carlos, but he politely declined, saying that the wheelchair wasn't about him, and that he preferred to let his work speak for itself. Alina had stopped by the shop several times during the construction process, bringing Carlos home-cooked meals and watching in amazement as the wheelchair took shape. She had tried to pay Carlos for his work, but he firmly refused any money, explaining that seeing Maria smile again would be payment enough. Alina was overwhelmed by the generosity of Carlos and all the neighbors who had contributed materials and support to the project. She had never experienced such kindness from people who barely knew her family. The day finally came for Carlos to present the wheelchair to Maria. He had asked Alina to bring her daughter to the shop at sunset, when the harsh afternoon heat would give way to cooler evening air. Carlos wanted the moment to be perfect, and he had even convinced Maria Santos, the baker, to close her shop early so she could be there to witness the presentation. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood, and by evening, a small crowd had gathered outside Carlos's shop. Maria arrived in her old broken wheelchair, pushed by Alina, who was curious but trying not to get her hopes too high. Over the past weeks, Alina had watched Carlos work with incredible dedication, but she couldn't quite believe that his homemade creation would actually be better than equipment made by professional medical companies. She had seen too many disappointments in recent years to trust that something wonderful might actually happen to her family. Carlos wheeled his creation out of the shop with a flourish, and the gathered crowd gasped in amazement. The wheelchair looked nothing like the clunky medical equipment they were familiar with. Instead, it resembled a sleek racing chair, or perhaps a small vehicle designed for comfort and speed. The blue upholstery caught the golden light of sunset, and the polished aluminum frame gleamed like jewelry. Even the wheels looked special, with custom spoke patterns that Carlos had created using bottle caps donated by the neighborhood children. Maria's eyes widened in disbelief as she took in the beautiful wheelchair that Carlos had built specifically for her. She had never owned anything so elegant or well-made, and she couldn't understand why someone would go to such trouble for a girl they barely knew. Alina helped Maria transfer from her old wheelchair to the new one, and immediately the difference was obvious. The seat fit Maria's small frame perfectly, providing support exactly where she needed it, while allowing complete freedom of movement for her arms and shoulders. Carlos showed Maria how to operate the hand cranks, explaining that she could control her speed and direction with simple wrist movements. Within minutes, Maria was gliding smoothly around the plaza, her face glowing with pure joy as she experienced independent movement for the first time in 3 years. The electric motor was so quiet that it seemed like the wheelchair was responding to Maria's thoughts rather than mechanical controls. She could turn in tight circles, climb the small hill leading to the church, and even navigate the rough cobblestones that had been impossible with her old equipment. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause as Maria demonstrated her new mobility. Children ran alongside the wheelchair, laughing and shouting encouragement as Maria raced around the plaza faster than any of them could run. Alina stood with tears streaming down her face, watching her daughter smile and laugh with genuine happiness. For the first time since the accident, the transformation was immediate and dramatic, as if Maria had suddenly remembered who she was supposed to be. Carlos watched from the edge of the crowd, his own eyes moist with emotion as he saw his creation bringing such joy to the little girl who had captured his heart. The months of work, the financial sacrifice, and the sleepless nights were all worthwhile in this single moment of watching Maria rediscover her independence. He thought about Isabella and how proud she would be of what he had accomplished in her memory. As the evening wore on, Maria continued to explore her new capabilities with the wheelchair. She discovered that she could adjust the seat height for different activities, that the armrests folded down when she wanted to transfer to other chairs, and that the whole wheelchair could be folded and stored in spaces that would never accommodate her old equipment. Most importantly, she realized that she no longer needed to depend on others for basic mobility, that she could go wherever she wanted, whenever she wanted. The neighbors who had contributed to the project felt a deep sense of pride and community accomplishment. Maria Santos, the baker, hugged Carlos tightly, telling him that he had performed a miracle. Dr. Rodriguez examined the wheelchair with professional amazement, noting design features that were more advanced than equipment he had seen in expensive medical catalogs. Even the children who had collected bottle caps felt like they had played an important role in creating something magical. Helena tried once again to pay Carlos for his work, but he remained firm in his refusal to accept money. He explained that the project had given him purpose and meaning during a difficult time in his own life, and that helping Maria had helped him heal from his own losses. Carlos had discovered that giving freely of his skills and time created rewards that money could never buy, and he felt more fulfilled than he had in years. As the celebration continued into the night, people began to realize that something special had happened in their small town. A simple act of kindness had grown into a community effort that brought out the best in everyone involved. Carlos had not only built a wheelchair, but had also built connections between neighbors who might never have spoken to each other otherwise. The project had reminded everyone that they were part of something larger than themselves, a community where people cared for each other and worked together to solve problems. 3 months later, a sleek black sedan with tinted windows pulled up outside Carlos's humble repair shop, looking completely out of place among the dusty streets and simple buildings of San Miguel. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a tall man in an expensive suit who looked around with obvious curiosity at the neighborhood surrounding him. David Richardson, one of the world's wealthiest technology entrepreneurs and the founder of several companies that manufactured mobility devices, had traveled thousands of miles to meet the mechanic whose wheelchair design had captured international attention through a viral social media video.